The carriage door slammed shut before Evelyn Hartley could climb out on her own power. "You will not embarrass this family again," her father said, gripping her wrist through her glove. "Not this time." She pulled back. He did not let go. "Father, please. You refused Lord Pemberton in front of 40 guests. 40. Do you understand what that costs a man like me? A man in my position?" Evelyn's mouth went dry. Outside the carriage window, rain slid down the glass in long, shaking lines, and beyond it stood a house she did not recognize, though she had heard its name whispered in every parlor in London for the last 2 years. Renmore, the house of the ruined Duke. "You cannot mean to send me there," she said. "I already have." Her father released her wrist and stepped back, straightening his coat as though he had just finished a business transaction, rather than sentencing his daughter to a life she had never asked for. "The papers are signed, Evelyn. The banns will be read this Sunday. You will marry the Duke of Renmore within the fortnight. He is a stranger, worse than a stranger, they say." "I do not care what they say." Her father's voice dropped, and for the first time she heard something underneath the anger, something that sounded almost like fear. "I care that my daughter learns what obedience costs, and what its absence costs more." He left her standing in the rain with her trunk and her maid, and no more words to offer her. The front doors of Renmore opened before she reached them, pulled by a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that studied Evelyn the way one studies a stray animal that has wandered somewhere it should not be. "You'll be the new Duchess, then," the woman said. It was not a question. Evelyn Hartley. Mrs. Whitfield. Housekeeper. The woman looked past her, toward the empty drive, as if expecting someone else to appear. No one did. "His Grace is not receiving visitors today." "I am not a visitor. I am to be his wife." Mrs. Whitfield's face did something complicated, a flicker of pity crossing it and vanishing just as fast. "Come in out of the rain, then, your Grace to be. No sense catching your death before the wedding even happens." The inside of Renmore was colder than the rain outside. Evelyn noticed it the way you notice a held breath in a room. Portraits lined the entrance hall, their subjects painted with the same flat, joyless expression, as if the artist himself had not wanted to be there. Dust sat undisturbed on the frames of half of them. She did not meet her husband that day, nor the next. On the third day she found him by accident, in a corridor she had been told not to walk down. He was taller than she expected, and younger, though something in his stillness made him seem older than his years. He wore no coat, only a plain white shirt open at the collar, and there was a scar along his jaw that the candlelight made look deeper than it likely was. He did not startle when he saw her. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he has been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. "I was told the same about you, in a manner of speaking." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, gone before it could become a smile. "Lady Hartley, not for much longer, I understand." "No," he agreed, "not for much longer." He turned and walked away without another word, and Evelyn stood in the cold corridor, listening to his footsteps fade, wondering what kind of man says nothing else to the woman he is about to marry. The wedding itself took less time than the fitting for her dress had. A small chapel, a small number of witnesses, her father standing at the back with his arms folded, like a man overseeing a demolition rather than attending a marriage. The Duke wore black. He did not look at her once during the ceremony, not until the very end, when the priest told him he might address his bride. He leaned close, close enough that only she could hear. "I am sorry," he said, "for what is coming." Then he stepped back before she could ask him what he meant, and the priest was already moving them toward the register, and the moment closed over itself like water over a dropped stone. She thought about those 4 words for the rest of the day. "I am sorry for what is coming." Not "I am sorry for what has happened," not "I am sorry you are here," for what is coming. The wedding breakfast was a quiet, strange affair, attended by people who seemed to be performing celebration rather than feeling it. Evelyn sat beside her new husband and watched him eat almost nothing, his eyes moving constantly toward the windows, as if counting something outside that she could not see. "You are watching the weather," she said, when the silence became too much to bear. "I am watching the light," he said. "It changes early here, faster than it should. That is a strange thing to notice on your wedding day. There are many strange things about me, Lady Ashcombe. You will learn them faster than you would like." It was the first time he had used her new name, and something about hearing it in his voice made the whole day feel suddenly, sharply real. She was not simply a girl being punished anymore. She was a duchess, his duchess, bound to a man who spoke like every sentence cost him something he could not afford to spend. That night, he did not come to her rooms. She lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the wind pressing against old glass, and somewhere far off, footsteps that paused outside her door and did not enter. In the morning, Mrs. Whitfield brought her breakfast with an expression that suggested she expected to find Evelyn in far worse condition than she was. "You slept, then?" the housekeeper said, sounding almost surprised. "Should I not have?" "Most don't, not their first night here." She set the tray down and busied herself with the curtains, not meeting Evelyn's eyes. "The house takes some getting used to." "Is that what people call it? The house?" Mrs. Whitfield's hand stilled on the curtain rod. For a moment, Evelyn thought she might actually answer something true. "You'll want to stay out of the east wing," the housekeeper said instead. "His Grace's orders. Nothing good happens to people who wander down there." "What is in the east wing?" "Nothing," Mrs. Whitfield said, too quickly. "Nothing at all. That's rather the point." She left before Evelyn could ask anything further, and Evelyn sat with her cooling tea, turning the housekeeper's words over like stones in her palm. "Nothing at all. That's rather the point." A strange thing to say about an empty room. Empty rooms did not usually need locking, and they certainly did not need a duke's direct orders to keep his own wife away from them. She spent the following days learning the shape of her new life, the way one learns the layout of a house in the dark, by bruising herself against its corners. The staff spoke to her with careful politeness, and answered no question that mattered. The Duke took his meals separately more often than not, and when he did appear, he spoke little, watched much, and left the room the moment the conversation drifted anywhere close to himself. She noticed things instead, small things, the way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a door closed too hard, the way he counted the candles in a room before he sat down in it, his eyes moving along the wicks as if performing some private arithmetic, the way his hand would drift, without him seeming to notice, to a chain around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt, that he touched the way other men touched a wound, to see if it still hurt. One evening, dining alone because the Duke had sent word he would not be joining her, Evelyn found herself staring at a chipped teacup on the sideboard. It did not belong with the rest of the china. It was plain, unremarkable, the kind of cup a child might use, and yet someone had kept it, polished it, placed it carefully on a shelf, as though it mattered more than anything else in the room. She picked it up without thinking and turned it over in her hands. "That is not yours to touch." She had not heard him enter. The Duke stood in the doorway, and for the first time since she had arrived at Renmore, there was something raw in his voice, something that had slipped its leash before he could stop it. "I am sorry," Evelyn said, setting the cup down carefully, exactly where it had been. "I did not know it belonged to anyone." "It belongs to no one," he said. "Not any more." He crossed the room, took the cup, and returned it to the shelf with a precision that looked almost like ritual, aligning it just so, stepping back to check the angle before he seemed satisfied. Then he stood there a long moment with his back to her, and Evelyn understood, without being told, that she had touched something far more fragile than porcelain. "Your Grace." "Julian," he said, still not turning. "If you are going to live in this house, you may as well use my name. Your Grace makes me sound like my father, and I would rather not be reminded of him more than necessary." "Julian, then." She let the name sit in the air a moment before continuing. "What happened in this house?" He did turn then, and the look on his face was not anger, though she had braced herself for anger. It was something closer to exhaustion, the kind that settles into a person's bones after years rather than days. "Everything," he said, "and nothing you are ready to hear. I was married to you within a fortnight of meeting you, sent here as a punishment by my own father, and told to expect a monster. I think I am owed a great deal more than half an answer." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite a decision. More like the crack that comes before a decision, the first hairline fracture in a wall that has held for a very long time. "You are owed everything," he said quietly, "which is precisely why I intend to give you nothing. Not yet, not until I am certain you will not run from it. And if I promise I will not, then you will be the first," he said, and walked out of the room before she could ask him what he meant, leaving her alone with the teacup, the candles, and a silence that felt, for the first time, less like emptiness and more like something waiting to be understood. 3 weeks passed before Evelyn found the door unlocked. She had not gone looking for it. That was the strange truth of it, the thing she would turn over in her mind many times afterward. She had simply been walking the upstairs corridor with a lamp in hand, unable to sleep, and had found the door to the east wing standing open by no more than the width of a hand, as though someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to finish closing it. She should have walked past it. Instead, she stood there, lamp raised, listening to the house breathe around her, and told herself that looking was not the same as trespassing. That was a lie, and she knew it even as she told it to herself, but she pushed the door open anyway and stepped inside. The room beyond was not what she expected. She had imagined dust and ruin, the physical wreckage that matched the rumors about the man she had married. Instead, she found a room that looked as though someone had simply stepped out of it one afternoon and never come back. A small bed, neatly made, a row of wooden toys lined up along a shelf with the precision of a soldier's kit, a child's dress, folded and pressed, laid across the foot of the bed as though waiting for someone to wear it in the morning. Evelyn's chest went tight in a way she did not have words for yet. She moved closer, and the lamplight caught the edge of a small, framed drawing pinned above the bed. A child's hand had made it, all crooked lines and too much yellow, a sun with a face, and a house with smoke curling from its chimney. In the corner, in careful, adult handwriting, someone had written a name. Lily. The word settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Evelyn felt the ripples of it long after she had gone still. "I told you to stay away from here." She turned so fast the lamp nearly slipped from her hand. Julian stood in the doorway, and his face in that moment was not the careful, guarded mask she had grown used to. It was something else entirely, something that looked like the moment right after a wound reopens. "I did not mean to." "You never mean to," he said, "and yet here you are." The door was open. The door is never open. His voice had gone very quiet, and quiet, she was learning, was far more dangerous from him than shouting would have been. Which means someone opened it. Which means I have staff in my own house who cannot follow the simplest instruction I have ever given them. "Julian, do not," he said, "do not say her name in this room. You have no right to it." Evelyn felt something in her chest twist. Not quite anger, not quite grief, some tangled cousin of both. "I did not say anything. You were about to. I could see it in your face." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the lamp from her hands. Not roughly, but with a finality that told her the conversation, such as it was, had ended. "Leave this room, now please." She left. She did not have the courage, in that moment, to do anything else. But she did not go far. She stood in the corridor outside, listening, and heard him moving inside the room, heard the particular, careful sound of him straightening the toys she must have disturbed without realizing it, setting each one back exactly where it had been. He did not come out for a long while. When he finally did, he looked at her standing there and did not seem surprised. "You are still here. I could not make myself leave properly. I am sorry for that too, I suppose." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, the way a man's grip loosens on something he has been holding too tightly for too long. Her name was Lily. he said. "That much you have already guessed, I imagine, since you read it plainly enough. You do not have to tell me anything. I know. That is precisely why I am telling you." He looked past her, down the dark corridor, as if the words were easier to say to the shadows than to her face. She would have been 8 years old this spring. Evelyn did not speak. She had learned in 3 short weeks that silence pulled more truth from this man than questions ever did. "There was an accident," he continued. "2 years ago, a carriage, a bad road, weather that should have kept sensible people at home." His jaw tightened, the scar along it catching the lamplight. "I was driving." The words landed between them, and neither of them moved to pick them up. "My wife," he said, and then stopped, correcting himself with visible effort. "My first wife. Margaret. She did not die that day, but something in her did, and she left within the month, and I have not seen her since. I do not blame her for it. I would have left me too, if I could have managed it. Julian, I built this room exactly as it was," he said, talking over her now, as though he had decided the words needed to come out all at once or not at all. "The toys where they were. The drawing where she pinned it. I do not go in there to grieve, Lady Ashcombe. I go in there because it is the only place in this house that has not changed since the last day everything was still whole." Evelyn thought of the teacup on the sideboard, polished and precisely placed. Of the candles he counted before he sat. Of a man who had built an entire private religion out of keeping things exactly where they had once been, as if stillness could somehow hold back the version of the story where his daughter was still alive. "And the rumors," she said carefully. "The ruined Duke, the scandal. Is that also?" "I let them believe what they wished to believe," he said. "It was easier than the truth. Easier to be called a monster by people who did not know me than to be pitied by people who did. Pity is a slower kind of cruelty, Lady Ashcombe. I have had quite enough of both. You could have told someone, cleared your name. To what end? My daughter would still be gone. My wife would still be gone. The only thing correcting the rumor would have changed is how comfortable other people felt in my company. I did not think that was worth the effort." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way he had not managed to do since the wedding. "You are the first person in 2 years who has asked me a direct question and waited to hear the true answer instead of the convenient one. Perhaps that is because I have nothing better to do in this house of yours. You keep me rather short of entertainment." It was meant lightly, a small offering of humor into a conversation that had grown too heavy to carry without some relief, and for a moment it worked. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. "I suppose I ought to apologize for that as well." "You have apologized enough for one evening, Your Grace." "Julian," she corrected herself before he could. "Save the rest for tomorrow. I have a feeling we will need it." He walked her back to her rooms in silence, but it was a different silence than the one that had followed her through the house for 3 weeks. This one had shape to it. Weight, the particular quiet of 2 people who have stopped pretending not to see each other. At her door, he paused. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking at me the way everyone else does, now that you know." "How does everyone else look at you?" "Like a cautionary tale," he said, "like a lesson other men tell their sons, about what grief does to a person who has nowhere left to put it." "I do not think you are a lesson, Julian." "What do you think I am, then?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she had learned he preferred, rather than offering him a soft, easy comfort he would see through in an instant. "I think you are a man who has spent 2 years punishing himself for something that was, in the end, simply terrible luck and bad weather. I think you built a shrine out of guilt and called it grief, and I think you have been waiting for someone to tell you that you are allowed to stop." He did not answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rougher than before. "That is a very bold thing to say to your husband of 3 weeks. You did not marry a timid woman, Julian. You married the woman who refused Lord Pemberton in front of 40 guests, remember. Boldness is rather all I have to offer." Something in his face changed then, some final piece of armor sliding loose, and for the briefest moment she thought he might reach for her hand, might close the small distance still standing between them. Instead he stepped back, and the careful mask slid back into place almost as quickly as it had lifted. "Good night, Lady Ashcombe," he said, and turned to walk away before she could see whatever expression had settled onto his face in the retreat. She stood in her doorway a long while after his footsteps had faded, thinking of a room frozen in time, a name pinned above a child's bed, and a man who counted candles and polished teacups, because it was the only way he knew to keep himself from disappearing entirely into the wreckage of what he had lost. She did not sleep for a long time that night, but when she finally did, she dreamed not of the East Wing, nor of her father's carriage, nor of the wedding she had never wanted. She dreamed of a sun with a face drawn in a child's careless yellow, and a house with smoke curling gently from its chimney, as though somewhere, in some version of this story, nothing had ever gone wrong at all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider who did not wait for a reply. Evelyn found Julian standing in his study with the paper gripped so tightly in his hand that the edges had begun to crumple. He did not look up when she entered, and that alone told her something had gone badly wrong. "Julian?" "Lord Pemberton," he said, and the name came out of him like something bitter he needed to spit before it poisoned him. "It appears your former suitor has not forgotten the insult of your refusal. What does he want?" "Money, mostly. Men like him always want money, though they dress the wanting up in nobler words." He handed her the letter, and she read it quickly, her stomach tightening with every line. Pemberton claimed old debts against the Renmore estate, debts supposedly owed by Julian's late father, and threatened to bring the matter before the courts unless a considerable sum was paid within the month. "Is it true, the debt?" "There was a debt, once. My father was reckless with money in ways I spent years correcting, but this amount is inflated well beyond anything that was ever truly owed. This is not a man collecting on an honest claim, Evelyn. This is a man punishing me for marrying the woman who refused him. Then we refuse to pay it. It is not so simple. If he brings this before the courts and wins, even partially, it will not merely cost me money. It will reopen every rumor about this house that I have spent 2 years letting die quietly. Men will ask why the ruined Duke suddenly has courts and creditors circling him again. They will ask what else might be true, if this is." Evelyn felt the old fear rising, the fear that had first been placed inside her chest during that first carriage ride to Renmore, the fear of her father's anger, of scandal, of being made into a public spectacle for other people's amusement. But underneath it, something else was rising too, something sharper, something that felt, oddly, like relief. It felt like anger, and anger, she was beginning to learn, was a far steadier thing to stand on than fear ever was. "Then we do not let him win quietly," she said. "We fight him properly." Julian looked at her with something like surprise. "You sound remarkably certain for a woman who has been married 3 weeks. I have spent 3 weeks learning that this house survives on secrets and silence. Perhaps it is time it tried honesty instead." He studied her for a long moment, and she watched him weigh the idea the way a man weighs an unfamiliar tool, uncertain whether it will help him build something or simply cut him. "Explain," he said. "Lord Pemberton wants 2 things. Money, and the satisfaction of watching you suffer publicly for having what he could not. If we take away the second, the first becomes far less appealing to him. He does not simply want coin, Julian. He wants a spectacle. Let us refuse to give him one." "How?" "We go to London. Together, publicly. We let ourselves be seen, at the theater, at dinners, wherever fashionable people gather to whisper about each other. We do not hide from the rumors any longer. We answer them, calmly, plainly, in our own words, before Pemberton has the chance to twist them further. You want me to walk into the very rooms that have spent 2 years calling me a monster. I want you to walk into those rooms as a man who has nothing left to hide, because you will have already told the truth before anyone else has the chance to lie about it for you." She held his gaze, steady, refusing to let him look away first. You told me yourself, Julian. You let people believe what they wished, because the truth felt too heavy to carry into a room full of strangers. I am offering to help you carry it." Something in his face cracked open again, the way it had in the East Wing, except this time there was no grief behind it. There was something that looked almost like hope, fragile and unpracticed, like a muscle that had not been used in a very long time. "You would do that? Stand beside me while half of London decides what to make of us. I already stood beside you at an altar in front of people who thought they were sentencing me to a punishment. I imagine London society will be considerably less frightening than my own father's face on my wedding day." He almost smiled then. Almost. They left for London 3 days later. The city had not grown any kinder in the 2 years since Julian had last set foot in it, and Evelyn felt the weight of every glance the moment their carriage rolled to a stop outside her aunt's townhouse, where they were to stay for the length of the season. Servants peered from windows. Neighbors found sudden, urgent reasons to be standing at their own front steps. The ruined Duke had returned to town, and he had brought a bride with him, and the whole street seemed to be holding its breath to see what happened next. Evelyn had expected Julian to retreat under the weight of it, to fold back into the careful silence she had learned in the corridors of Renmore. Instead, something in him seemed to straighten, as though the very act of being watched had reminded him how to stand up straight. "They are waiting for me to flinch," he murmured, watching a cluster of women across the street, who were making an unconvincing show of examining a shop window rather than staring at his carriage. "Then do not give them the satisfaction. I have had 2 years of practice not flinching, Lady Ashcombe. I simply did it by disappearing instead. This is a rather different discipline." The first true test came at Lady Fenwick's dinner, 3 nights after their arrival, an event Evelyn suspected her hostess had arranged specifically because she knew half the guest list would be desperate to see the ruined Duke in the flesh. Conversation stilled the moment they entered the room, the way water stills before a stone breaks its surface, and Evelyn felt dozens of eyes settle on them at once. Lord Pemberton was among the guests. Of course he was. He stood near the fireplace with a glass of wine in hand, and an expression of carefully constructed pity that fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the satisfaction underneath it. "Your Grace," he said, approaching them with a bow that was a fraction too shallow to be respectful. "And Lady Ashcombe, how very brave of you both to venture out among decent company. Lord Pemberton," Julian's voice was perfectly level, "I understand you have taken a keen interest in my family's finances of late." A ripple moved through the nearby guests, several of them abandoning all pretense of not listening. "Merely settling old debts, Your Grace. Nothing personal in it, I assure you." "How curious, then, that the sum you claim bears no resemblance to any debt my father ever actually incurred. I have the estate ledgers with me in London, should you care to examine them alongside your own claim. I find precision tends to clear up misunderstandings rather quickly." Pemberton's smile thinned. "Are you accusing me of dishonesty, sir?" "I am accusing you of arithmetic," Julian said. "Whether that arithmetic was born of dishonesty or simple carelessness is a distinction I will happily leave to the courts, should you insist on pursuing this matter that far. Though I confess, I suspect you would rather not have my ledgers examined quite so publicly as that would require." The room had gone very quiet now, and Evelyn watched something in Pemberton's composure begin to slip. "This is hardly the place," Pemberton said stiffly. "You raised it," Julian said. "I am simply finishing the conversation you started." Evelyn stepped forward then, feeling every eye in the room shift toward her, and found that she did not care in the way she once might have. "Lord Pemberton," she said, keeping her voice light, almost pleasant, the tone of a woman discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. "I recall refusing your proposal on the grounds that I did not believe you and I would suit. I see now that I was entirely correct, though I confess I did not anticipate quite how thoroughly you would prove my instincts right." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest guests, quickly stifled but not quickly enough. Pemberton's face went the color of old wine. "You will regret this," he said, low enough that only the 3 of them could hear it clearly. "Both of you." "Perhaps," Julian said, but I find I regret a great many things already, Lord Pemberton, and none of them involve standing beside my wife in a room full of people who have finally stopped whispering long enough to hear the truth for themselves." Pemberton left the dinner within the half hour, and by the following morning, the story had already begun to travel through London in the particular unstoppable way that gossip does. Except this time the story was not about a ruined duke hiding some terrible secret. It was about a man who had faced down a lord's false claim in front of half the season's fashionable guests, with his new bride standing unflinching at his side. It was not victory, not entirely. Pemberton did not withdraw his claim outright, and the lawyers spent the following weeks in careful correspondence, working through the actual ledgers, the actual sums, until the inflated debt was whittled down to something closer to the truth, and Pemberton, faced with the prospect of his dishonesty being laid bare in open court, quietly let the matter drop, rather than risk further embarrassment. But something else had shifted, something Evelyn had not fully expected. Invitations began arriving at her aunt's townhouse, not out of morbid curiosity this time, but out of something that looked almost like respect. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the ruined duke now found reasons to greet him at the theater, to ask after his health, to speak of him in tones that no longer carried the particular cruelty reserved for men whose stories had been written for them by strangers. Julian noticed it too. She watched him notice it, watched the slow, careful way he began to hold himself in rooms full of people, less like a man bracing for a blow and more like a man remembering, gradually, what it felt like to simply exist without flinching. "You did this," he said to her one evening, as their carriage rolled back toward her aunt's townhouse after a considerably less hostile dinner than the first. "I did very little. You were the one who stood in that room and refused to disappear." "I have disappeared for 2 years, Evelyn. I built an entire life around disappearing. You are the reason I stopped." "Then perhaps," she said, "we ought to stop referring to this marriage as a punishment. It seems to have turned into something else entirely." He reached for her hand then, the first time he had done so without hesitation, without the careful distance he kept from nearly everything that mattered to him, and held it the rest of the way home in a silence that felt, for the first time since her father's carriage had delivered her to Renmore, entirely safe. But safety, Evelyn would soon learn, was rarely as permanent as it felt in the moment it arrived. They returned to Renmore at the end of the season, and Evelyn had allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding day, to believe that the worst of the storm had passed. She was wrong, and she learned it the moment their carriage came to a stop in the drive, and Mrs. Whitfield came rushing out to meet them, her face pale in a way Evelyn had never seen it. "Your Grace." The housekeeper's eyes went to Julian first, then flicked, briefly, guiltily, to Evelyn. "There is a visitor. She arrived yesterday and would not be turned away. I told her you were not expected back until today, but she insisted on waiting." "Who?" Julian asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer and did not want it confirmed. "Lady Margaret," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly. "Your first wife, Your Grace. She is in the drawing-room." Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her, though she remained perfectly still. Julian had gone rigid beside her, his jaw tight, the scar along it standing out pale against skin that had lost its color entirely. "I did not know she was in England," he said. "Nor did I, Your Grace, until she arrived at the door with a single trunk and no warning at all." Julian turned to Evelyn, and for a moment she saw every careful wall he had built over 2 years, threatening to collapse at once. "You do not have to come in with me. I am your wife," Evelyn said. "I think I would rather hear whatever she has come to say than imagine it alone in another room." The drawing-room felt smaller than Evelyn remembered it, though she suspected that had nothing to do with its actual dimensions. A woman sat near the window, dressed in traveling clothes still dusty from the road, her hands folded tightly in her lap, in the manner of someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. She looked up as they entered, and Evelyn saw, in the sharp lines of her face, in the way grief had carved itself permanently into her features, a woman who had never truly stopped grieving, no matter how far she had traveled to escape it. Julian. Margaret's voice cracked slightly on the single syllable of his name. Margaret. He stopped several feet from her, as though some invisible boundary kept him from coming closer. I did not expect you. No, I imagine you did not. Her eyes moved to Evelyn, taking in the sight of her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between curiosity and old, tired pain. You have remarried. I have. Good. The word surprised Evelyn, coming out of Margaret with something that sounded almost like relief. That is good, Julian. I did not come here to make trouble for you. I came because I could not live with the silence any longer, and I did not think it was fair to either of us to let it continue. What silence? Julian asked, and his voice had gone rough, in a way Evelyn had only heard once before, in the East Wing, standing over their daughter's untouched room. The one where you believe you are the reason she died. Margaret rose from her chair, and though her hands trembled slightly, her voice did not. I left because I could not look at you without seeing that road, Julian. I left because grief made me cruel, and I did not trust myself not to say things to you that could never be unsaid. But I have spent 2 years thinking of little else, and I need you to hear this properly, from me, and not from whatever story you have built in your own mind to punish yourself with instead. The room had gone utterly silent. Evelyn did not dare move, did not dare breathe too loudly, aware that whatever was about to be said had been 2 years in the making and did not belong to her to interrupt. It was not your fault, Margaret said. The road was flooded. The bridge gave way beneath the wheel before you had any chance to stop it. I have spoken with 3 separate men who examined that crossing afterward, and every one of them told me the same thing. That bridge had been weakened for months, that the county had been warned and done nothing, that any carriage crossing it that week would likely have met the same fate, regardless of who held the reins. I was driving, Julian said, and the words came out of him like something that had been lodged in his throat for 2 years, finally forcing its way free. I should have taken a different road. You took the road we always took, Julian, because there was no reason on earth to believe it would fail beneath us that particular night. You have spent 2 years rewriting a tragedy into a crime you committed, because it is easier to carry guilt than it is to carry grief that has no one to blame. I understand that impulse better than anyone alive, because I did the very same thing to you, and I am sorry for it. I am sorrier than I know how to say. Julian's hand had found the back of a chair, gripping it hard enough that his knuckles had gone white, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might simply fold under the weight of the words, 2 years of carefully constructed penance crumbling all at once. Why now? He asked. Why come all this way, after 2 years, to tell me this now? Because I heard you had remarried, Margaret said, glancing again at Evelyn, and because I could not let you carry a second marriage the same way you carried the first one, buried under guilt that was never yours to bear. You deserve better than the life you have built for yourself in this house, Julian. You always did. I simply was not strong enough, back then, to be the one to tell you so. She crossed the room, and before Julian could step back, took both his hands in hers. Grieve for her, Margaret said softly. Grieve for Lily every day for the rest of your life, if that is what your heart needs. But stop grieving for the version of yourself you believe let her die, because that man does not exist. He never did. Julian did not speak. Evelyn watched something break open in his face, not the sharp defensive fracture she had seen before, but something slower, something that looked almost like relief arriving after an unbearably long delay, grief finally allowed to be simply grief, without the added weight of blame he had carried alongside it for 2 years. Margaret released his hands and stepped back, composing herself with visible effort. I will not stay, she said. I have said what I came to say, and I have no wish to disturb whatever peace you have found. She turned to Evelyn, and something in her expression softened further. Take care of him. He does not know how to ask for it himself. She left within the hour, her trunk loaded back onto the same carriage that had brought her, and Evelyn stood beside Julian in the drive, watching the dust settle behind the departing wheels, uncertain what words could possibly follow a conversation like the one they had just witnessed. "Julian?" He did not answer immediately. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were wet in a way she had never seen them, not once, in all the weeks she had known him. "2 years," he said. "2 years I told myself I deserved every rumor, every whisper, every ounce of ruin that fell on this house, because I believed I had earned it, and it was never true. None of it was ever true." "No," Evelyn said gently, "it was not. I do not know what to do with that. You do not have to know yet. Grief does not clear itself all at once simply because someone hands you the truth. But perhaps," she said, taking his hand the way Margaret had, though with an entirely different intention behind it, "you might allow yourself to stop building shrines to your own guilt and start building something new instead." He looked down at their joined hands, and for the first time since she had arrived at Renmore in the rain, weeks and a lifetime ago, Evelyn watched him truly smile, not the careful, guarded, almost smile she had grown used to, but something open, something unpracticed, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man remembering what happiness had once felt like before the world had taken it from him. "Come inside," he said. "There is somewhere I would like to show you properly this time, if you are willing." She followed him back into the house, through corridors that had once felt cold and unfamiliar, and now felt, simply, like home, until they stood together outside the door to the east wing, the one she had once opened by accident, and he had once guarded like a wound that could never be allowed to breathe. "Are you certain?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I would rather be uncertain with you beside me than certain and alone, the way I have been for 2 years. He opened the door, and this time he did not stop her from stepping inside. The room smelled of dust and old paper, the particular scent of a place that had been sealed away from the ordinary business of living. Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, while Julian moved slowly toward the window, his hand trailing along the edge of the small bed as he passed it, the way one touches something sacred without quite daring to hold it fully. "I have not opened these windows in 2 years," he said. "Would you like me to do it, or would you rather do it yourself?" He considered the question longer than it seemed to warrant, and Evelyn understood that it was not really about the window at all. It was about whether he was ready to let air move through a room he had kept perfectly, painfully still since the last day his daughter had breathed it. "Together," he said finally, "if you do not mind." They crossed to the window side by side, and his hands found the latch, old and stiff with disuse, while hers rested lightly over his, steadying rather than helping, since the strength required was entirely his own to spend. The latch gave with a groan, and then the window swung open, and afternoon light poured into the room in a way it had not been permitted to for 2 long years. Dust motes danced in the sudden brightness. Somewhere outside, a bird called, ordinary and unbothered by the significance of the moment inside, and the sound of it seemed to loosen something in Julian's chest that Evelyn felt rather than saw. A long breath finally let go after being held far too long. "She used to open this window every morning," he said quietly. "Even in winter. She said the room felt like a held breath if we did not. She sounds like she understood a great many things most children do not. She was better than either of us deserved," he said, and this time when his voice caught, he did not try to hide it. "I am glad you finally get to know her name properly, Evelyn. I am glad it is no longer a secret I am keeping from you. Thank you for trusting me with it." They stood together at the window for a long while, not speaking, simply watching the light move across a room that had finally been allowed to breathe again, and Evelyn felt something settle into place inside her chest, some final piece of the strange, sideways life she had been sentenced into weeks before, clicking quietly into a shape she recognized now as something closer to a beginning than an ending. The weeks that followed brought changes to Renmore that Evelyn would not have believed possible on the rainy afternoon she had first arrived. Mrs. Whitfield stopped speaking of the house in hushed, careful tones, and began instead to speak of it the way one speaks of a place slowly waking up after a long sleep. The staff, who had spent 2 years tiptoeing around a grief they were never permitted to acknowledge directly, seemed to breathe easier themselves, as though the whole household had been holding the same held breath as that locked room, waiting for someone to finally open the window. Julian did not become a different man overnight. Evelyn had not expected that, nor would she have trusted it if it had happened so easily. He still counted candles sometimes before he sat in a room, an old habit that did not vanish simply because its origin had finally been named aloud. He still touched the chain beneath his shirt when memories rose unbidden, and some evenings he grew quiet in a way that told her Lily was close to his thoughts, and on those evenings Evelyn learned simply to sit beside him, not fixing, not filling the silence with reassurance he had not asked for, only staying. The way she had learned weeks earlier was often worth more than any words she might have offered instead. But the silences grew shorter, the evenings grew warmer, and slowly, in the way that seasons change without anyone quite marking the exact day the shift occurs, Renmore began to feel less like a house holding its breath, and more like a home that had simply been waiting for someone to remember how to live in it properly again. Lord Pemberton's claim against the estate dissolved entirely by early autumn, the lawyers finding no honest debt remaining once the true figures were laid plainly against his exaggerated demand, and word reached them, second-hand, that he had quietly left London for the countryside not long after, his reputation having suffered rather more from the dinner at Lady Fenwick's than either Julian or Evelyn's had. Evelyn found she felt no particular satisfaction in his ruin, only a quiet relief that the matter was finally, fully closed, one more piece of the old life swept away to make room for whatever came next. Her father wrote once, in early winter, a stiff, formal letter inquiring after her health and offering, in the careful language of a man who did not know how to properly apologize, something that might have been regret dressed up as politeness. Evelyn read it twice, then folded it away in a drawer, uncertain whether she would ever answer it, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not much mind either way. The punishment he had sentenced her to had turned into something he could never have predicted and would likely never fully understand, and she found she needed neither his approval nor his apology quite as badly as the girl who had climbed out of that carriage in the rain once had. It was Julian who noticed the anniversary approaching before she did, the date marked quietly in the estate ledger in his father's old hand, 2 years since the accident, and it was Julian who suggested, tentatively, that they mark it differently this year. "I do not wish to hide from it," he said, "the way I have every year before, but I do not wish to disappear into it either. I am not entirely certain what stands between those two things." "Perhaps we simply try, and see what we find," Evelyn said. "There is no correct way to grieve someone properly, Julian. There is only the way that lets you keep living afterward." They spent the day together in the garden behind the east wing, a patch of ground that had gone wild and untended for 2 years, and rather than letting it remain a monument to neglect, they knelt in the cool autumn soil and planted a small bed of flowers beneath Lily's window, the kind with too much yellow in them, the kind a child might have drawn with a careless, joyful hand. It was not a grand gesture, it did not undo anything, nor was it meant to, but when they finished, and stood back to look at the small splash of color against the gray stone of the house, Evelyn saw something in Julian's face that she recognized, at last, as peace rather than merely the absence of pain. "Thank you," he said, "for being the person who opened that door when it was left ajar. I know I was furious with you at the time. You were terrifying, actually. I have been informed I have something of a reputation for that. An entirely undeserved one, as it turns out." He laughed, then, properly, the sound rare enough still that it caught her by surprise every time she heard it, and something in her chest warmed at having been the one to cause it. "I believe," he said, taking her hand as they walked back toward the house in the fading autumn light, "that I owe you an apology, properly given this time, rather than the strange half-sentence I offered you at our wedding. You said you were sorry for what was coming. I have thought of that sentence more times than I can count since. I meant it honestly, at the time. I believed I was condemning you to the same slow ruin I had built for myself in this house. I did not yet understand that you were not the kind of woman who could be condemned to anything without eventually rearranging the terms entirely to suit yourself. That is, I believe, the closest thing to a compliment you have ever paid me, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected gently, "we are long past Your Grace, I should think." "Julian, then." She squeezed his hand. "For what it is worth, I am not sorry, not for any of it, not the carriage, nor my father's temper, nor the wedding neither of us wanted. I do not think I would trade the life that came after it for the one I was originally promised." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the gold light of the late afternoon, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. "I love you," he said, simply, the words arriving without the careful hesitation that colored nearly everything else he said. "I did not expect to be capable of it again. I certainly did not expect to feel it for the woman my own ruin was meant to punish." "I love you as well," Evelyn said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the words came easily, without any of the fear she might once have expected to feel in offering them. Punishment turned out to be rather poorly named for whatever this actually is. They stood together in the garden a while longer, the small yellow flowers nodding gently in the evening breeze beneath the window of a room that had finally learned how to hold light again, and somewhere inside the house, Mrs. Whitfield lit the evening candles without needing to be asked twice, humming quietly to herself, in a home that had, at long last, remembered how to be one. The story that had begun as a sentence, delivered by an angry father in a rain-soaked carriage, ended not with the ruin everyone had promised, nor the punishment it was meant to be, but with two people who had each been broken in their own particular way, finding, almost by accident, that they fit rather well together in the space where their broken pieces met. Renmore no longer whispered its secrets through cold corridors and locked doors. It simply stood, quiet and steady in the autumn light, holding a family that had chosen, at last, to stop hiding from its own past and start living, plainly and honestly, in whatever came next.